On the 7th of April, 1945, something happened in the East China Sea that is difficult to call a battle in the conventional sense of the word, because a battle implies two participants who each have at least some chance of winning. The largest battleship in human history, a vessel that cost more to build than any military project in Japanese history, a vessel about which thousands of workers had signed written oaths of silence under threat of punishment that no one dared define precisely, sailed out to meet the enemy. And 2 hours later, it was gone. 386 American aircraft from 11 carriers against one ship, of whose 3,332 crew members, 276 survived. But the strangest thing about this story is not that Yamato sank. The strangest thing is that many Japanese officers knew it would sink before the ship ever left port. They knew. They said it aloud in closed meetings. And they sailed anyway. That is what this video is about how a decision gets made that kills 3,000 people and changes absolutely nothing, and about what exactly in the mechanics of that decision matters more than the fact of the ship's destruction itself. In 1921, the 5 largest naval powers gathered in Washington and attempted to do what victors always attempt after a major war: agree on the rules of the next one before it begins. The naval treaty signed in 1922 established a simple ratio: for every 5 American and 5 British battleships, 3 Japanese, maximum displacement 35,000 tons, maximum gun caliber 16 inches or 406 millimeters, 5 to 3. Japanese admirals accepted that math and immediately began thinking about how to get around it, because 3 against 5 in a direct confrontation meant one thing: defeat. Quality, therefore, had to compensate for quantity. Every Japanese ship had to be so much better than any American counterpart that the ratio would cease to matter in practice. From that simple formula, 5 to 3, the largest battleship in history would eventually be born, and a decision that would kill thousands of people. In 1935, Japan withdrew from the treaty and lifted all restrictions from itself, and the design work on the new ship, which had been conducted in secret since 1934, finally received official permission to become steel and iron. The concept was simple in its formulation and monstrous in its execution. Build a ship so large and so heavily armed that no adversary could fight it on equal terms. A ship capable of firing from a range at which American guns simply could not reach it. The only weakness in this concept was an assumption built into it from the very beginning: the assumption that the next naval war would be fought by the rules of the previous one, that the battleship was still the pinnacle of naval power, that gun defeats gun, and that the bigger gun always defeats the smaller. That was true in 1894. By 1936, the final specifications had been approved, and they had no precedent in the history of shipbuilding: 263 meters in length, roughly 2.5 American football fields placed end to end, full displacement of 71,500 tons, nearly a quarter larger than the biggest American battleship of the Iowa class. But displacement figures make no impression on someone who has never seen a warship. So here's a detail that is easy to picture. Each shell from Yamato's main guns weighed 1.5 tons, the same as a modern compact car, and 9 such shells the ship could fire simultaneously at a range of 40 kilometers, roughly 25 miles, which is farther than the horizon visible from the top of a mast. The armor on the faceplates of the main turrets reached 650 millimeters, 25 inches of steel. And to produce plates of that size, Japan had to build specialized metallurgical capacity, because existing factories physically could not roll armor to the required dimensions. Construction cost roughly $2.5 billion in today's money, required the expansion and reconstruction of the dry dock at Kure, and took nearly 4 years. And all of this, I should emphasize, was built so that no one on the outside would know what was happening inside. On the 4th of November, 1937, the keel was laid at Kure, and the laying down ceremony was so quiet that people living a few blocks from the shipyard learned nothing of it that day, nor for many years afterward. Traditionally, the laying down of a warship was a public event, a ceremony with officials and photographers, but Yamato's keel laying was attended by a handful of naval staff officers and shipyard executives, with no photographs released, no announcements made, and no ship's name appearing in any official document, because in the documents it was listed only as Warship Number 1. Wooden barriers were erected around the dock, tall enough to conceal the growing hull from outside eyes, and part of the dock was covered with matting screens that made aerial observation impossible, in case any foreign power thought to send a reconnaissance aircraft over Kure. At the shipyard in Nagasaki, where the sister ship Musashi was being built simultaneously, the situation was more difficult. The city had a large foreign community, and the construction slipway was visible from almost everywhere. So Japanese authorities were forced to hang a screen of hemp cloth around the shipyard measuring 75,000 square meters, enough fabric to cover roughly 10 football fields. Every worker admitted to the project signed an oath, not a non-disclosure agreement in the modern corporate sense, but an oath with wording that left no room for interpretation. I am aware that all work relating to the construction of Warship Number 2 is vital to national security. I will make every effort to maintain the secrecy of the project and swear that I will disclose no information relating to the said warship, even to relatives and close friends. In the event that I violate this oath, I will submit to the punishment determined by the company and the Navy. The secret police vetted workers before they began and continued surveillance throughout the process. Foreigners, particularly those of Chinese origin, were removed from the shipyard in 1937 when preparations were only beginning. Officers with access to the real technical data were instructed to avoid specifics even in private conversations ashore. Thousands of people worked on both shipyards. And it worked. Official documents recorded Yamato's displacement as 42,000 tons, her armament as 9 guns of 40-centimeter caliber, her speed as 25 knots. The real figures, 71,000 tons, 46-centimeter guns, 27 knots, were known to a handful of senior officers, and Americans did not learn the truth until the very end of the war, when it no longer mattered whether they knew it or not. The launch on the 8th of August, 1940, also took place without an audience. The dry dock was simply flooded, the hull rose and rocked, and a few military officers watched in silence, without an orchestra and without a crowd. On the 16th of December, 1941, 9 days after Pearl Harbor, when Japan was already at war, Yamato was officially commissioned into the fleet. The most powerful battleship ever built by human hands entered a war at the precise moment when the nature of naval warfare had already begun to change, and it would be that change, specifically, that would render everything spent on the ship's creation utterly meaningless. But that understanding was still several years away. On the 12th of February, 1942, Yamato became the flagship of the combined fleet under Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, and that appointment, which sounded like the highest honor, meant in practice exactly one thing. The ship was too valuable to risk in actual combat. She was being preserved for the decisive battle, that fleet versus fleet, battleship versus battleship confrontation that Japanese naval doctrine had been predicting since the beginning of the century, and for which, essentially, this entire monster had been built. In June of 1942, Yamamoto directed the midway operation from Yamato's bridge, while Japanese carriers burned 300 miles ahead. The main guns were silent. After Midway, Truk, an anchorage in the Caroline Islands where Yamato sat for most of the year, because the Japanese staff could not decide how exactly to use a ship that was too valuable to lose, but too slow to respond to a rapidly changing operational situation. The main guns were silent again. In June of 1944, the Philippine Sea, the largest carrier battle in history, which American aviators would later call the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, for how one-sided the outcome was. Yamato was there. The main guns were silent again. By October 1944, when Yamato finally opened fire with her main guns at American ships off Samar Island in Leyte Gulf, she had been in service for nearly 3 years, and in all that time had not fired at an enemy once. The engagement off Samar lasted a few hours, and Japanese Admiral Kurita, in the middle of the battle, incorrectly concluded that he was facing major carriers rather than an escort group, and turned away without completing the attack. By that point, the sister ship Musashi was already on the bottom of the Sibuyan Sea, after taking 19 torpedo hits and 17 bomb hits. That was a direct lesson about what happens to battleships without air cover when American aviation operates unhindered. Yamato did not read it, or read it, but drew no conclusions because there was no one in a position to draw them. On the 1st of April, 1945, American forces landed on Okinawa, and the Japanese naval staff found itself facing a question it had no answer to. What can a fleet that had virtually ceased to exist as a fighting force do against an armada of several hundred American ships anchored off an island 160 miles from the Japanese mainland? On the 29th of March, a few days before the landing, at a meeting with Emperor Hirohito in attendance, someone raised a question about the Navy's role in the coming defense. A question that senior naval officers received as a direct rebuke for inaction, because an imperial question in Japanese military culture of that period functioned roughly as a directive. If it was asked, action was expected. Admiral Soimu Toyoda, commander of the combined fleet, ordered an operation to be developed, and the result was named Ten-Ichi-Go. Operation Heaven No. 1. But if you think there was any strategic calculation of success in this operation, consider what was written in the order itself, verbatim. Surface Special Attack Unit. In the Japanese military language of 1945, the words special attack had exactly one meaning. They were the same words applied to kamikaze pilots. They meant suicide. Yamato, the light cruiser Yahagi, and 8 destroyers were to depart Japan on the 6th of April, pass through the Bingo Strait, reach Okinawa by dawn on the 8th of April, and attack the American fleet of transport vessels, the ships carrying soldiers and equipment to the beachhead positions. After the attack, and this is specified in the official order, the ships were to beach themselves on Okinawa, continue firing until the last shell was expended, and the surviving crew members were to go ashore and fight alongside Japanese infantry units to the last man. This was a plan in which return was not envisioned for either the ships or the people, which is precisely why the operation was formally designated a special attack. Air cover was promised only for the first few hours after departure, after which the ships would be alone against American aviation based on 11 carriers, numerically superior to any possible Japanese fighter support in that area by dozens of times. The details of the operation had not been shared with the ship commanders until the last possible moment, and when on the 5th of April the captains of Yamato, Yahagi, and the 8 destroyers were finally assembled and the plan was laid out, what happened next is described by Japanese military historians as the closest thing to open insubordination in the entire history of the Imperial Navy. Yahagi's commanding officer, Captain Tamechi Hara, Admiral Keizo Kimura, and several other senior officers objected out loud, which by the standards of Japanese military culture, where subordination was not merely a disciplinary requirement, but part of a deeply held worldview, was an act that demanded considerable personal courage, regardless of the substance of the objections. They said it plainly. The operation had no reasonable chance of success, even by its own stated objectives. And they were right on every point. Vice Admiral Seiichi Ito, who had been given command of the operation, listened to the arguments, spent several hours alone in his cabin, and in the end gave his consent. Not because the plan's logic had persuaded him, but because the logic of the culture in which he had grown up and served his entire life left him no other exit. When one of the surviving officers later described the atmosphere at that meeting, he used the word doom, not in the sense of fear, but in the sense of absolute clarity about what would happen, combined with an equally absolute absence of any mechanism that could stop it. But here is a question worth asking directly. If practically everyone understood that the mission was suicidal and would achieve nothing, why wasn't it canceled? The answer has several layers, and each matters. The first layer, by April of 1945, Japanese military command was operating in conditions where acknowledging the real situation meant acknowledging that everything invested in 4 years of war, millions of human lives, the entire industrial capacity of the country, had been for nothing. And that acknowledgement was psychologically and institutionally impossible for the people who bore responsibility for it. The second layer, in the Japanese military hierarchy of 1945, there was no mechanism by which a mid-ranking officer could stop an operation already approved at the level of the fleet commander, even when the arguments against it were entirely obvious. The third layer, and perhaps the most important, the operation was not conceived as an attempt to win the war. By that point, no one with access to actual casualty statistics seriously considered victory a possible outcome. The operation was conceived as a demonstration that the Japanese Navy was dying in battle rather than at a pier, and that distinction, which seems abstract from a distance of 80 years, had concrete institutional meaning in the context of back-channel negotiations about possible surrender terms that Japanese leadership was already quietly conducting. That is precisely why no Army representatives were invited to the April 5th meeting. The operation was the Navy's internal matter, and its meaning was understood only by those who knew what exactly was being left unsaid at these meetings. The crew of Yamato learned the real nature of the mission at the meeting on the 5th of April, when the details were finally shared with everyone, and not just the commanders. And the reaction aboard was more complex than simple acceptance or simple fear. About 80 men, young cadets, the sick, those the command deemed appropriate to remove from the ship before departure, were sent ashore. The remaining 3,252 men stayed. Many wrote letters, which by Japanese tradition in such circumstances were called yuigon, last letters, and which were handed to those remaining ashore. Some wrote jisei, death poems, a genre with its own strict form and its own history in Japanese literary tradition stretching back to the medieval period. Captain Hara, commanding officer of Yahagi, assembled his crew before departure and delivered a speech that several survivors later quoted, "Our mission appears suicidal, and it is. But suicide is not the objective. The objective is victory. We are going not to die. We are going to win and change the course of the war." No one listening to that speech believed it. Not really. And no one stepped off the ship. On the 6th of April, 1945, at 15:20 hours, Yamato weighed anchor. American intelligence had decoded the operations orders in late March, earlier than most Japanese captains had learned what they were being asked to do. When Yamato entered the Bungo Strait, American submarines were already waiting, which recorded the formation's position, course, and speed, and transmitted everything to the carriers of Task Force 58. Admiral Mark Mitcher knew Yamato had departed before she had left Japanese territorial waters. 386 aircraft, fighters, dive bombers, torpedo bombers, lifted off from 11 carriers in the early morning of the 7th of April and headed north toward the position where American radar was already tracking the thermal signature of the Japanese formation. Over the attack area, ceiling was low, approximately 900 meters. Poor weather for high-altitude bombing, good for low-level torpedo attacks, and American commanders used it exactly that way. At 12:32, the first wave attacked. By that point, several Japanese sailors on the bridges of the ships had already understood what no one had said out loud. because there was not a single Japanese fighter above Yamato and her escort, and the sky that should have been filled with friendly aircraft was empty, except for the American machines coming in from multiple directions simultaneously. Yamato opened anti-aircraft fire from 162 25mm guns, and also fired her main guns with special cluster shells that burst above the water's surface and created a cloud of metal fragments, a tactic specifically designed against low-flying torpedo bombers, but one that proved significantly less effective in actual conditions than the calculations had suggested. The first wave lasted roughly 25 minutes and left Yamato with 2 bomb hits and 1 torpedo hit, enough to ignite a fire aft that was never extinguished, but not enough to reduce speed. At 13:20, the second wave arrived. American aviators applied the same tactic they had already refined against Musashi 6 months earlier. Dive bombers attack from altitude, drawing the attention of anti-aircraft crews and forcing them to elevate their barrels. At that moment, torpedo bombers come in from low altitude from all directions simultaneously, preventing the ship from turning, so that the torpedoes would strike the most heavily armored part of the hull. Several torpedo bomber crews, noticing that Yamato was beginning to list to port, independently adjusted their torpedoes' running depth from 3 meters, where they would have struck the main armor belt, to 6 meters, where below the waterline was unprotected plating exposed as the list increased. That decision, made without orders, by a specific crew on a specific aircraft, accelerated the ship's destruction. By 1400 hours, Yamato had confirmed 11 torpedo hits and 8 direct bomb hits, and the list to port had reached 35 degrees, the angle at which counter-flooding could no longer correct the ship's trim without deliberately flooding the engine compartments, which meant losing speed and losing all remaining maneuverability. Part of the crew in the lower spaces was trapped by the rising water. The order to abandon ship was given with a delay that later became a matter of dispute among survivors. Some of them said the order came too late for most of the men on the lower decks to get out. At 14:23, Yamato's forward magazines exploded, and the explosion that followed was visible from the shores of Kagoshima, 180 kilometers from where the ship went down, as a column of flame rising 2,000 meters and a mushroom-shaped cloud of smoke climbing to 6,000 meters. The shock wave was felt on the decks of Japanese destroyers several kilometers away. Then it was quiet. The flagship of the Japanese combined fleet went to the bottom, 340 meters down, in the East China Sea. Time from the first attack to the ship's destruction, 1 hour and 51 minutes. 4 surviving destroyers pulled 276 men from the water, out of the 3,332 who had left Kure 2 days earlier, which meant the death of 3,055 people, among them Admiral Ito and Captain Aruga, both of whom had tied themselves to the bridge structure long before the explosion. American losses for the entire operation: 10 aircraft, 12 aviators killed. Yamato was not destroyed by a tactical error that could have been corrected with a better maneuver or improved anti-aircraft guns. She was destroyed by a structural error built into her very concept back in 1934, when designers began planning a ship for a war that no longer existed. There is a detail in this story that matters more than the fact of the ship's destruction. Yamato never fought an American battleship, not once, not a single main gun shot at an enemy vessel of her own class, because the American fleet did not come with battleships. It came with aircraft. And what is especially important for understanding the scale of this miscalculation, the Japanese Navy had demonstrated this principle itself in December of 1941, when Japanese aircraft sank the British battleship Prince of Wales off the coast of Malaya without fighter cover in 1 hour and 20 minutes in open sea. That happened 9 days after Yamato was commissioned, while the ship was still being fitted out in dock. In 1985, a Japanese expedition found Yamato's wreck on the bottom of the East China Sea. The ship lies in 2 main sections. The explosion split it almost in 2, and the gun turrets with their barbettes structures weighing hundreds of tons, are torn off and scattered across the seabed separately from the hull, and one of the anchor chains is missing, knocked away by a direct bomb hit during the attack. In Kura, there is a museum whose centerpiece is a 1/10 scale model of Yamato, 26 meters long, reconstructed from original blueprints, wartime photographs, and underwater survey data. And that museum stands exactly where the ship was built, exactly where it departed on its last voyage, exactly where it did not return. 3,055 people died on the 7th of April, 1945, in the East China Sea. The majority of them sailors who, in more than 3 years of service on this ship, had seen nothing but transit runs between bases, anchorages in sheltered bays, and waiting for a battle that kept not arriving, and which, when it finally came, lasted less than 2 hours. They did not die for victory, because victory was mathematically impossible by the moment Yamato weighed anchor, and the people who gave the order knew this just as clearly as everyone else who had access to the actual casualty statistics. They died so that the fleet would die at sea rather than at a pier under bombs, and that distinction mattered to those who gave the order, though for 3,055 men on the floor of the East China Sea, that distinction probably meant something altogether different. Yamato was exceptional at what she was built to do. What she was built to do had ceased to exist. If this video gave you something most military history channels don't, not just facts, but an understanding of how decisions get made that kill thousands of people, and why people who know about the disaster in advance still don't stop it. Subscribe, because that is exactly what this channel is. Next episode, how American sonar operators on submarines heard the destruction of the Japanese fleet in real time.